always think there should be like a body laid out in an anatomical theater that we're examining, we're trying to take it apart. And maybe there is. I have to first thank Jim Bassett and Ron Daniel for making all this happen, along with Hunter, somehow convincing me that I probably need to show up here for the semester while I'm on my faculty development leave. So I put together a book proposal on the work of Giancarlo de Carlo. So that's critically important. And I think my own research, like any sincere research, owes a great deal to a whole body of different voices. A lot of those voices come in the form of books and texts, journal articles, but others come in the form of conversations and discussions. And these are perhaps even more important, even though they don't get mentioned very often in the footnotes. Professor Dennis Kilper, who taught here, actually never the studio I was in. My wife was in his studio one semester. He introduced me to Team 10, and specifically the work of Giancarlo de Carlo, and I think that I'm forever grateful for that. Monica Mozzolani and Antonio Tuasi, both of whom you haven't heard of, worked for Giancarlo de Carlo for a number of years, starting in the mid-'80s. And they have a firm, MTA Associates, that they practice. They carry on the banner. They carry on the teachings and the practice of de Carlo. And I've also had the great privilege of co-teaching with them in Urbino. So I've been teaching in Urbino in Italy since 2008. One semester a year. I mean, it's a nice perk. It's actually not a perk, it's a lot of work. But our study abroad program was developed by my wife and I, and is still being taught today, except for we have like 92 students a semester going over there. Sometimes it dips down to about 72. And we work pretty closely with Monica and Antonio in Urbino. But there are a couple others I need to thank. I need to thank Benedict Zucchi. He's an architect in London. He also worked for de Carlo for a number of years. And he wrote the first book in English that introduced sort of the English-speaking world to a range of projects that de Carlo was involved in. And I recently had the opportunity to work with Zucchi on his most recent book, Big House, Little City, which actually explores the Albertian dictum, the sort of metaphor between house and city, the ratio. We'll touch on that a little bit today, but I helped him work on that as he completed it. But I also like to thank Frank Weiner for extending a meaningful and productive exchange of words and ideas that began over 30 years ago. So, I mean, this is not research that has happened in the last year. This is research that has been being built since the time that I was teaching here, and maybe even before that. Most importantly, I'd like to acknowledge a deep and profound debt to Professor Hunter Pittman. Through all kinds of practice, writing together, teaching together, sharing books, sharing meals, conversation, and tossing around a diversity of ideas, he has challenged me in ways that continue to extend my capacity to think about the world I'm within. So the talk is divided into 5 sections. They're not equal. And we start out with fracture, this notion of fracture. And fracture, in this case, we're going to be talking about World War II. And actually, we're not going to be talking about it. I'll be mentioning why this fracture is critical. And then we look at the discourse which develops in the work of de Carlo, but also the larger polemic, which is occurring at the same time throughout mainly Italy. And this is critically important because being part of that discourse was what really prompted his deep commitment to Urbino, which we'll talk about. Following Discourse, a little bit of sort of a deviation, and that's kind of a pun if you know anything about mannerism. Talk a little bit about mannerism. And I think mannerism is within the larger dialogue today that architects are beginning to sort of come out and acknowledge sort of their debt to the tendencies which mark the Mannerist period. Carlo was no exception. And then I'm going to talk about a multiple language, which perhaps is the most interesting portion of the talk, and get into the building. I'm only showing you one building today. I'm showing you Ca Romanino. It's really Casa Romanino, but Northern Italians and Venetians, they kind of slur everything, so it's Ca Romanino. If my Italian is not perfect, please, I ask your forgiveness. So you can't see this. I have a mimeograph. Do any of you know what a mimeograph? Frank, you know what a mimeograph is. You can probably still smell the mimeograph. This one's wrinkled. Philosophy 2111. Dr. Nick Smith. Take home midterm examination. He gave us, why am I still holding this? He gave us a Nick Smith was like one of the most important professors I think I've ever had. And for the midterm exam, he gave us this invented 16-line fragment that we had to reassemble and try to kind of extract a cosmology out of 16 lines of text. And so we were allowed to argue and discuss and debate. And sadly, Hunter got the best grade in the class, and Blizard did not. But it still has stayed with me, this notion of the fragment, this notion that somehow, if we have enough fragments in front of us, we can put them together and perceive a story, a narrative. And I think that's critically important, that somehow we search for the whole even after the fragmentation. And in Italy, perhaps more so than any other part of the world, there's a huge number of these architectural monuments. And in a way, we have a hard time appreciating the fact that they have to live with history. History is not something you put under glass. In San Antonio, we have Alamo, which for some reason people associate with freedom. In actuality, it has everything to do with slavery. But it's celebrated as this monument to the past. And of course, it's practically under glass. Well, in 1902, the Campanile in San Marco in Venezia fell down. I mean, you were just, imagine sitting there having a coffee and all of a sudden, the Campanile falls. And it was sitting there for a little while, and people were trying to figure out, what are you going to do with this pile of brick? And the word sort of spread that we must build it where it was, how it was. Now, of course, this doesn't take into consideration the fact that it was built initially in the 10th century and that underwent quite a few number of different renovations since that time before you even get up to the Renaissance, where it was substantially changed. So this notion of Camera d'Ovra is actually a little bit of a fiction in that we're talking about not so much about deep history, we're talking about memory, what we remember. And perhaps that's a critical starting point for understanding historic preservation today. So when we look at a fracture like World War II, and again, this is only a partial timeline, but I think it's meant to kind of position Ca Romanino within a larger discourse, a discourse that includes a CIAM, and specifically, I'm calling attention to the 33 meeting where the Athens Charter was one of the products not the only one, but it's the one that Le Corbusier put forward as sort of codifying, urban design at that time period. In 36, there was a wonderful exhibit at the Biennale in Milano, or the Triennale in Milano, and it was by Giuseppe Pignano. And this is called Rural Architecture, and it was really a flashlight, a large flashlight being shined on the vernacular architecture of rural Italy. At a time period when you had a lot of questions about the nature of the present, obviously, sort of caught up in the fascist regime at the time, it kind of fit into early pictures of nationalism. But it was much more than that. And after the war and the fracturing of society, Carlo and his spontaneous architecture exhibit was a crucial contribution to reconnecting and putting these pieces back and finding a continuity. I have to also give a lot of tribute to Ernesto Rogers, who we may know from some of his work, the Torre Velasca in Milano, and his work with BBPR, which was critical in trying to understand what a modern architecture is in a post-war period that still remained tied to place and to the continuity with the past. Anyway, so there's a series of events that take place that lead us to Urbino in 54, and Carlo carries on his work in Urbino until 2005 when he dies, incidentally after a snowstorm. And this commitment essentially was crucial because in Urbino there are 15 works of architecture, completed large works, not small ones, which are right there. So you can begin to see the development of his thinking, and you can start to understand why it's such a crucial place to visit and to spend some time. And then, of course, Team 10, which comes on the heels of the collapse of CIAM. In fact, it probably contributed to it. And Carlo's very strong connection to both CIAM, teaching in a summer school in Venice, which incidentally Denise Scott Brown was one of his students. Those of you who know anything about Venturi Scott Brown, maybe that's a coincidence. But Ernesto Rogers was the mentor who introduces Carlo to these circles of voices which are arguing and discussing the discourse at the time. And then Carlo Menino. So again, the war in this country, knock on plastic, has been devoid of any major acts of war that are at the scale that we're talking about. And this is a photograph from Firenze, from Florence, and you're looking at the devastation caused by the retreating German soldiers and the advancing Allied armies. And so you can just imagine the cities, Dresden, which was firebombed, right? Berlin, which was largely shredded. The cities in Europe and the countryside in Europe were totally disrupted by this, to the point where people began to really question how to move forward. This is not just one building collapsing. This is the potential of an entire series of civilizations collapsing. What do you do? And of course, architecture, urban design, planners, psychologists, sociologists, they all kind of get together and argue about how to go forward. And the initial focus for this very interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and certainly a tremendous number of international voices which are brought to bear was in Matera. And so we have a Jewish intellectual, doctor, physician, who was self-exiled because he was in disagreement with the fascists. He was an anti-fascist. And so he was exiled from the north to a small town in the south, and it was not Matera. And after the war, soon after the war, he puts together the collection of writings and notes that he took during that time in this slightly fictional account, which is Christ stopped at Eboli. And what's intriguing about this book is it's a very good book. It's a very interesting book. But it only has like 3 or 4 paragraphs about Matera. And yet, again, by calling attention to the poverty of the South, the lack of sanitary conditions, the troglodytes, as they were called, who lived in these caves, that essentially were almost this third world, which was embedded within Italy. And of course, no one really saw it because everyone was too busy up in Turin making fiat. Henri Bresson was part of a group, this international group. So was Olivetti, those of you who collect old typewriters, and I know Bill Green isn't here, but to try to bring enough people together, maybe you'd come up with a solution. And it was interesting because I think that there was a lot of lessons that were learned, even though most of the work that came out of it was to some extent a complete failure, right? So we have this group of people living in caves, and we extract them from a cave, kind of hints of Pruitt-Igoe, yeah, sort of, and then we put them in new towns. And this is what was intriguing, is the obsession that this international group had. And by the way, DiCarlo is one of them, and Ernesto Rogers. The obsession they had with a couple of really interesting things. Number one, this interrelationship between the Sassi and the topography. So the Sassi are the caves, and the topography is very karst, a very layered limestone, and you can carve right into it, and you extract the stone, and then you build the front of the dwelling outside of the cave. Fascinating, intimate relationship between architecture and land. And then, of course, the vicinato, or the vicinati, which are poorly translated as neighborhoods. And by the way, when I'm using an Italian word, I'm trying to specifically be aware that it has nuances which are not going to be conveyed in English. In English, we translate this as neighborhood, which, by the way, has very little to do with what it is. It's a public space which brings together a series of individual dwellings, which are also not necessarily limited to some sort of nuclear family, but often have extended families inhabiting them. The same image that I saw as a student that Henri Bresson photographed when I was last in Matera. I sought out that same vicinato. And of course, the city inextricably tied to the land. As you walk through a small piazza, you are in fact walking on a roof. So La Martella was one of the products of this. And La Martella, located some kilometers away from the historic city, the Sassi, was an abject failure. And even though we might find it very folkloric and very romantic as we even look at this example of 1950s reflection of the romance of the rural condition, actually there's some good architecture there. And so that's kind of the backdrop for a lot of these arguments and discussions. And in the foreground, we have some projects, and I'll just mention the Tour of Alaska because I mentioned BBPR. And this was presented, interestingly enough, in Waterloo at the CIAM conference. And Ernesto Rogers, who presented it, had to really defend this against a series of people who felt that it was certainly not very modern looking. So now appearance was ranked higher than substance. It's in the downtown. It's actually just, this photograph was taken from the roof of the Duomo, from the cathedral. So it's very close to downtown. The Florentine repristination, which you saw the photograph, of Florence, right? And well, it's all of a sudden rebuilt. And you look at that and you have no idea when these buildings are built in the 50s. And they're built to recapture some of the atmosphere that the Florentines felt was uniquely theirs. So you embedded within this interesting fabric of background buildings, there are occasionally old medieval structures and Renaissance buildings, which are still there, but very few. And Gardella, it's worth mentioning, in part, DiCarlo worked for him for a couple of years, as well as Albini. So, I mean, it's an interesting dialogue. It's not just one person, sort of struggling alone in their closet to generate an architecture. It's people who are actively involved with each other. And actively involvement needed some sort of vehicles. And one of the critical vehicles was Casa Bella. So Casa Bella was edited, interestingly enough, by Pagano before the war, the same architect who put together the rural architecture exhibit. And when Ernesto Rogers took over, then it became, wow, we have to think about the continuation of the past. We have to think about trying to understand that continuation as a way to go forward. Just like DiCarlo's search for spontaneous architecture was not so much a reflection of the past, but an attempt to understand the vernacular as you move forward and look for an alternative urban model for design. It's one thing to look at a lot of farmhouses and get, wax poetic about them and start thinking that that there's some sort of folkloric is the word I used, depth to them when it's not there. But Casa Bella is a platform for a serious series of discussions. And of course, surprise, he brings his young protege, DiCarlo, to serve as an editor at Casa Bella, Continuata. Now, I'm taking some words out of context. I'm taking 4 words out of the thousands and thousands of words that Ernesto Rogers wrote as a public intellectual, not just as an architect, but he saw himself as part of a larger public discourse. In many ways, he's very much like Walter Gropius, in that his great strength was the capacity to bring together a diversity of different voices, including, surprise, surprise, people like Aldo Rossi, which gets right back, Hunter, to those days in Kogel Hall when I was obsessed with Aldo Rossi. Anyway, so here's DiCarlo's contribution to Matera in Spine Bianchi. It's a new community which is located on the north part of one of the hills, just above the Sassi, where a new quarter was being developed at the time. And there's a lot of interesting architects who really were given their start, young architects who were given their start in Matera. This building was also presented in Otterloo in '59. And again, the big problem was appearance. It has a pitched roof. That was the sole problem that the modernists felt with it. So, Coerenza, tendenza, continuata, lambente. I think that ultimately those words can be really roughly translated here, and there's a reason I'm taking a moment to look at them. That coherence, and again, this is coming out of context. So Ernesto is not with me now to deny that I'm what I'm about to say, and to return to his understanding of these particular terms, which were very important for his writing and his architecture. But I'm trying to see them as a seed, a germ, that DiCarlo was able to carry forward, in part through misreading. So coherence is what really gives a project its coherence, a coerenza. And it's regarding the whole, and the nature of the whole, and how that whole is somehow unified from what may at first appear to be fragments. Tendenza, tendency, and I'm not referring to Aldo Rossi's group of rationalists. I mean, they just appropriated the word because Ernesto was really good at coming up with some very good words. Tendency, the tendency which governs how you arrange architectural elements. We're going to come back to tendency, or tendenza. Continuata, of course, is continuity, but it's continuity that implies progression, all right? And not any sort of stasis. So it's not like you have an ice cube and the continuity of the ice cube is it stays to be an ice. No, it melts. And so this notion of whatever happened before the war and whatever happened during this period of fracture that led to the student uprisings in the 1960s, and actually in Italy it happened before that, even in the 50s, there were a lot of students who took to the streets trying to demand something from their government who seemed to be stuck in a static condition. And then, of course, DiCarlo was part of those student uprisings as well. So DiCarlo takes these words for, l'ambiente, I mean, environment, atmosphere. The French have a beautiful word, milieu. I almost said that correctly, but milieu, right? This notion of the environment. And this is something that needs to be studied and understood, because an architecture which follows and understands the complexities of the voices which are present in the milieu can design an architecture that's going to stay contributing to place. In other words, we're back to that notion of fragment and the uneasy whole. I'm going to kind of skip over Team 10. I already talked about them. I do want to mention that the word circle just came up. And I think that if any of you have a desire to really make the most of your education for the rest of your life, you'll start to form sort of circles of people who get together and eat good food and drink coffee. I'm sorry. Sorry, Shelley. It's okay. Tea is okay. Special circle for tea. But the circle is, you guys are not individuals. You like to pretend you're individuals. We're obsessed with individualism in this country, and it's all hogwash. I mean, what's really important is how you engage each other and how you engage these larger discussions, these dialogues. And Team 10, unlike most of CIAM, is an attempt to essentially get together and have friendly disagreements and arguments, and to present your work and to challenge each other to rethink a more humanist approach to architecture. Photograph from Otterloo in '59. You can see DiCarlo there as well. So DiCarlo's contributions are quiet. Okay, one of them, the most important one, is this book, which is, as soon as he finished his work in Matera, he's invited to come up to Urbino by Carlo Bo, who's the rector, is like the president of the university. And at this time, these universities in Italy are going from rather small universities with populations of maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people to all of a sudden exploding, and almost overnight, 10, 15, 20,000. And so what Carlo Bo has in mind is to hire someone who knows how to bring different voices together and to analyze the town. So before anything happens, well, he's doing a few projects, designing some beautiful street lamps. While he's doing this, he's also conducting this deep reading of the city and the region, which is Urbino. And that's an economic reading, it is a social reading, it is a physical reading, it has to do with views and how we perceive the environment, it has to do with historical contexts and historical narratives as well. And this is published in a report which is submitted, the report's initially submitted in, I believe it's '62, and it becomes officially adopted by the city, because it also includes a plan of development. I would call him an urban planner at this point. And then it becomes a book. It's published as a book in Italian in '66. And of course, MIT publishes it some years later. But this book was critically important because it really makes instrumental the concept as the centro storico, which comes out of a whole different discussion, but the notion of what to do with these old cities, which are, if they weren't destroyed by the war, they were like Arezzo, but if they weren't destroyed by the war, people were leaving them. Why were they leaving them? Because there's no jobs. I mean, it's only recently, right, that we go back and we wax poetic about being someone who manages olive trees. Just before I came here, my wife and I planted 3 olive trees in Texas. And then it got cold, who knows? I'm praying for them. This book was critical. It was adopted very quietly as being the model for trying to understand traditional cities. Now, this is critically important. And the reason it's important is because, in this case, Carlo Bo, with DiCarlo and a whole series of other voices, decide to put the new university, the bigger building, into the city fabric without disrupting the fabric, in fact, contributing to it. Absolutely amazing. And of course, Carlo Menino, which we're still trying to get to. I know we're still trying to get to it. This may last until 5 or 6 tonight. Mannerism. It's interesting that this also was a time of crisis. There also was a fracture here. There was, Martin Luther and the 95 Theses, which all of a sudden you have the Catholic Church, which starts to appear to crumble like the Campanile. And that's only like 12 years prior to the sack of Rome by Charles V. I mean, we think of Rome as the eternal city. Well, it was constantly getting hit by the Visigoths, in this case by the Holy Roman Empire himself. Emperor himself decides to come in and sack. And of course, he tried to control his minions, but they raped and pillaged. Ice of their day. Anyway, these are very, very well-respected Mannerist paintings, and they're absolutely fascinating for many respects. And Mannerism, I think, is very often misunderstood. And one of the reasons it's misunderstood is because we like to assume that because there's an ism, that it's a movement, right? And we can talk about the rules and the codes, if you will, of the Florentine Renaissance. We can talk about the use of one-point perspective and naturalism. Here we can't. Okay? Instead, what we have is a series of tendencies. So there's a tendency. And I'm not going to go into all of them here, and it's a fiction to try to come up with a list anyway, but I think some of these really help you understand that if we study the Mannerist architecture and Mannerist paintings, we begin to see these tendencies. And we're going to come back to some of them, the idea of openness, like the work of Umberto Eco when he talks about a text being open, which means that the reader participates in it and brings something towards the text. Fragmentation, of course, the notion of the fragment as being inherently part of the composition. Tensions, uneasy tensions. Do you notice that Madonna here has a long neck? No, she has a long neck. But she's sitting here on her throne of heaven, but there is no throne. There's no chair. So I mean, there's this odd feeling that maybe she's floating on a cloud, a billowing sail of beautiful, rich, dark blue fabric, like the heavens themselves are supporting her. And as we look at here, we're constantly moving. There's this incredible sense of movement, and we find kind of a polycentric painting where first we glance at Mary, and then down to the beautiful gesture. That's quite the exaggeration. We follow her tunic down to the Christ child, who, by the way, appears to be dead, as if we're thinking about the Pietà as opposed to a small Christ child. We're thinking about the dead Christ who was brought down off the crucifix and placed in Mary's lap. And instead, clearly making a reference to it. A child, by the way, who's contorted and about ready to fall off the lap of the floating mother. So I think there's a lot of interesting things here. And we can say, well, Jesus, they just don't get it. They don't know what a woman should look like. They don't, they have a hard time. What's this little guy down here in the bottom right? Where did he come from? Did he step in from another painting? there's a lot of disquiet here that it's a very difficult thing to put together. So these are going to stay with us. But I also need to mention, since we were talking about Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, that Venturi's work in Rome led to this book, which incidentally, a lot of people helped him with because he's not a very good writer, very much like me. You need a lot of different voices there. This is before his well-known collaboration with Denise Scott Brown, although she does seem to be involved in part of this. I'm not going to expect you to read this, but this is, that's why it's small. This is Venturi's sort of reflection of what architecture or an architecture of mannerism is. In fact, he actually went back and years later, he said, if I had to rename this book, I would call it Mannerism in Architecture. Now, just down the street from where I lived, where I grew up, was this wonderful little building. In fact, it was right next to my, is it upside down? Did I put it upside down? No, it's not upside down. But this may be the first complex and contradictory building that Venturi did. This was really right before the work that Venturi did with his mother's house, which is so iconic, and certainly before this obsession with Las Vegas and pop culture and signage and things like that, simulacra. It's a fascinating building, and I happen to see it probably once every 2 to 3 weeks for a huge portion of my childhood. Colin Rowe's essay, I know it's like, where the hell is Carlo Menino? I thought this was about Carlo Menino. Well, 1950, Colin Rowe, and we don't, I think we keep focusing on him as if he is kind of a one-hit wonder. He was a crucial writer who contributed so much to understanding by serving as a bridge from other disciplines. And so he's reading and studying things like mannerism and beginning to apply it or bring it into the discourse about modern architecture. There are other books which I obsess with, including Arnold Hauser's book, which is probably the most important book here on mannerism, 1966. And in it, he really describes for the first time, and he's an art historian. There's that little guy again. I told you he stepped from one painting to another. He brings in the notion of tendency, and that we have to understand mannerism not as a style, not as a set of rules or a school of thought at all, but as a series of tendencies to almost emphasize narrative structure through a series of rhetorical devices. Cultural constructions can only be mediated by the experience of the subject and its historical, economic, political, and social context. Does that not sound like what they tried to do in Matera? Does that not sound like what Carlo was proposing as a model for approaching traditional urban form? That we have to begin to look at things beyond the drip line of the international style. The aim, and this is from a 67, this is right after Carlo Menino was built, or maybe before the last brick, the mortar in the last brick had cured. The aim of the design process is to achieve see, this is large, that means you can read it, right? If it's really small, don't waste your time. You know, just get a copy of Complexity and Contradiction and eat it, and it will be in your mouth as sweet as honey, but it will make your belly bitter. The aim of this design process is to achieve, that was almost a joke. Didn't come off very well, did it? The aim of the design process is to achieve a multiple language. Now, he's not saying multiple languages. This is no pastiche. This is not Venturi, right? This is a multiple language, capable to adapt to the changing circumstances, the consumption of time. It's like he's reading Marcus Aurelius, that passes to various levels of knowledge, of perception, meaning end users and those people who would be visiting or who might be seeing the building for the first time. Levels of knowledge, levels of perception, the different expectations of many possible interlocutors, those who question the interlocutor, a language composed of many equally significant strata. And those strata come from his excavations of the culture, the fabric, which we know as Urbino. So the next time you're in Rome, which hopefully is soon, please proceed directly due north. There's a bus that takes you from Tiburtina, and in 4 hours you can step off your bus in Urbino. From Firenze, I'm sorry, unless you're driving yourself, you got to go up to Bologna. So Urbino is dense, it's tight. What we know of it is it's a very, very well-preserved hill town. And part of that is because it's not on a train line. So you can go there and there's only thousands of German tourists, and there's very few other people. But it's composed of these really tight medieval streets. In fact, streets which, unlike the one you see here, but there are also streets which are Roman in origin, because it was originally a Roman town. And then you have these large piazzas that are clearly the work of Renaissance thinking. And we have to attribute that to the work of Duke Montefeltro, who created a circle, yes, a circle of writers, of artists, of architects, of political thinkers. Alberti was there hanging out for a little while. Francesco di Giorgio Martini was there. There was a work of numerous painters who really contributed to the Renaissance. This was one of the major places where Renaissance thought came into being. There's that beautiful lamp. Isn't that incredible? Frank has got me obsessed with it ever since we talked about the other day. So for 50 years, this place becomes a laboratory. You know, it becomes a resource that you can mine it for understanding of how building and landscape, culture and narrative all sort of collude and come together. I'm not going to talk about these projects. There's some, I see when I teach there, I actually teach in his buildings. And it's just absolutely amazing. And our students become honorary students of the university. So they get to mill around with the Italian students and, you know, have a coffee with them or perhaps something else. So, Carlo Menino, this is what you were waiting for. I believe that we should look at this not as a simple house. I think we have to look at it as a sort of a condensation of an approach to architecture which had just reached this moment of fulcrum between Carlo's early years, early influences, which we outlined, and all of his later work. And luckily, my wife and I were able to spend like 26, 28 hours in the house. And so you get to see it during many of its moods, which are fantastic. And as a reminder, Madonna of the Long Neck is going to follow you. And so we're just keep those in mind, those tendencies. By the way, these are excavated from quite a few different readings, a lot from Hauser, but also from some of those other books and other readings that I've done on mannerism. So I'm kind of putting together an understanding. It would be nice if you had a book which was arranged like that. It just had all that list and one chapter on every one of those, but they don't exist. So we're talking about several kilometers outside of Urbino. In the bottom right, the circle indicates the residential campus where all the buildings are designed by Carlo. That's where we have our architecture studios. And then, of course, the historic city. You see the kind of the Noli map of that extracted. And then out in the countryside, you have this house for a philosopher and his wife. And like many houses, the act of building it somehow was related to their divorce. And Carlo Menino was given to Sagna Mora as part of the settlement. And she lived in it until she was in her 80s. And when you see the inside, you'll say, like, geez, how did... Because you climb, you have to engage the house. So I've been going back and from a series of measurements and from a few existing drawings, trying to recompose some of, in this case, a plan and some isometric drawings. And it's a really interesting building. I mean, you kind of pass through the earth, and then you enter, the arrows indicate entryways. There's 5 different ways to enter. Just like a medieval city, you can enter it in many different ways. This large red circle is of course, the hearth. The blue circle is the studiolo. Again, the word study doesn't quite work, especially in Urbino, where studiolo is a meaningful thing. I'm going to try to limit my talk to the garden, if we can call it that. The studiolo and the relationship between the hearth and this loggia, which is the 2 black piers that you see. And I just have to also remind you that I haven't lost sight of those 4 words, which I extracted from Ernesto Rogers. Okay, so I love that little gesture that the brick makes to sort of embrace the extension of the chimney, the pipe, as it heads up into the sky, this little graceful embrace. So Baldassare Castiglione writes one of the most important books, I mean, in many ways more important than the Prince by Machiavelli. This is a book which is situated in Urbino, kind of imaginary. Baldassare found himself in the court of I think it was the son of the Duke Montefeltro, who was the current duke at the time Baldassare was there. And he writes this book describing the court and what it is to be sort of civilized in a way by being part of the court. And in it, he makes this wonderful statement, echoing Alberti, that the Duke made this wonderful palazzo, which incidentally, Carlo thinks is one of the top 5 most important buildings ever designed in Italy. Interesting. But he says that the city is really not a palazzo. It's really a city in the form of a palazzo. And so I keep thinking that that's a good, in a way, a good metaphor to understand this very diminutive house, if we call it that, more like a city. So the narrative, in order to understand the narrative, we have to take a small step. I'm not going to go into it, but Carlo uses the word percorso narrativo, which in a way, if we were French and we were following the words of Le Corbusier, we would say, what do we say? We'd say the promenade, the architectural promenade. And this is certainly building on Corb and Corb's work, who De Carlo always admired. And you can begin to see that there's this kind of dialogue back and forth between elements of the city and then elements which are within this small building. And also must be mentioned that there's this tension which, in a way, comes out of mannerism, comes out of the mannerist, right? Where, Michelangelo, kind of a proto-mannerist, because those who came afterwards were in the manner of Michelangelo or Raffaello. But this is from the tomb, the Medici tomb in, or the chapel rather, in Florence at San Lorenzo. And it's really a fascinating pair of sculptures that indicate both the active life and then the contemplative life. And this notion of active and contemplative is very much kind of part, but also the dualities, the uneasy relationship between these kind of dichotomies. He kind of borrowed that a little bit from his close friend, Aldo van Eyck, who's, surprise, a member of Team 10. It's also interesting that as I was sketching, I'm thinking about the Palazzo Ducale, and I'm thinking about the audience chamber, the stanza della udenza, and how that chamber is kind of a parallel to the spazio di comunicazione. Okay, so because I think we have to accept the fact that our English words don't work. We can't say living room. I mean, you guys do it. You're working on your plans, and you put these names, these titles. This is living room, this is kitchen. And every time you do that, it's like you limit any possible meanings which are ambiguous. So this is a very ambiguous space. In fact, Morrow was expected to cook the meals at this hearth because originally there was no kitchen. It's like, okay, that works for about a week, and then camping is over. But there's a parallel between elements, whether it's the studiolo, which, by the way, Duke Montefeltro is really the inventor of the idea of this Renaissance studiolo, which is a whole other lecture and one I'll be delighted to give at some point in the future, far distant future. And there's a wonderful parallel between how they're organized in the Palazzo Ducale and how DiCarlo begins to reinterpret these things. He's having a dialogue with these historic forms. He's not appropriating them and plastering them on his building like some sort of pastiche. And again, not to be disparaging of fellow Philadelphian Robert Venturi, but certainly not like that. So I think these things are, come over you slowly as you inhabit the space. These references to different elements which are outside of the building itself. So we enter the building. But how am I with time? Am I okay? I'm not? Okay, so we're going to get there. We're going to get there. So I'm not just going to take you, I'm going to walk you through. Past the vineyard, up the hill. We have two major entries. We have this main and guest entry. There's Umberto Eco, he snuck in. And we have the family entry. So I think that the notion of this as a meeting place or a piazza is maybe more accurate than calling it a house, because if you're a guest there, you can come and go as you like, and the owners you won't disrupt them. So we follow this percorso. We begin to understand that there's this break between the historic building and the new building, and this takes us to this wonderful place which is on the terrace. And the terrace is directly connected to the individual cells below. So those skylights, which when they're open, you can hear what's happening in the cell below, which is this uneasy relationship. Just like between two of the sleeping cells, the walls move. Why would you do this? Because there's a need to really challenge the way we perceive human relationships. And relationships which were always changing as the day-to-day life changes within the Carlo Menino. The other entry is perhaps more seductive. So we're passing through the cleavage of the earth, almost a tunnel in a way very much like the streets of Urbino, these narrow streets, and we turn the corner. That's right at the rosemary plant, which is highly aromatic. We end up in this improbable garden. And I say improbable because it appears to be a piece of captured landscape which incidentally is very rugged, and it follows the contour of the site, except for this is not a piece of captured landscape. You can't do that. You have to actually build the garden. So it was very intentional to create a garden which is not a garden. It's the center of the house, but it's not the center. It's perhaps more related to the ideal garden, but it's not really a garden. It's hard to garden there. How do we even get into it? Right? So all these questions start to well up, and then we return back to the Palazzo Ducale for maybe some answers, and we find this subliminal space, which is referred to as a hanging garden, which is separated and joined to the landscape by a very theatrical wall that appears as a facade of another palace. And when we're in the garden, and the image in the bottom center, we can actually see this landscape. So there's this interrelationship between the palazzo, the improbable hanging garden, and the landscape. And of course, the notion of the courtyard as a central court of the Duke, the place where all the different voices come together. So we step in. Please ignore my backpack. We see the studiolo, the hearth, and the frame of the loggia. And there's our studiolo. I'm finding that it's not really a studiolo. I mean, for a while it was used as a veranda because there's a large door that you can open. It takes a little bit of effort, but you can open this door, and the door is either open to the exterior and closed to the interior, or it's open to the interior, the social space, and closed to the exterior, which means what? It means that this place of the individual, where the individual retreats, is intimately connected to the environment outside the building and connected to the social discourse that takes place around the table. So even at this most private center, we find that a human being is not private, but part of a larger discourse. It was also used as a dining room. So everything is sort of uneasy here. And it makes some incredible parallels in how it connects together. And again, if we had more time, we could get into this, but how it connects together the exterior environment with the interior. And it's a translation, a transformation of what we find in the Palazzo Ducale. It almost appears as an isolated, separate element, like its own little baptistry set within an urban fabric. That's not my photograph. The others have been mine. And so we sort of make a closure as we center around the hearth. We walk around. There's this tension built. His father, by the way, was a nautical architect and engineer. And I think that DiCarlo, in fact, I know that DiCarlo spent a lot of time going up and down in ships in Genoa, and no doubt stole one of these forms, at least intellectual theft here. And we're left with the loggia, which, like any loggia, it's a transformation. It's my wife sketching up in the loggia. You have to climb up to get to the loggia. You swing back and forth on these little handles. You can see them in the upper right. You can see the red handle. And you can, I mean, can you imagine like an 80-year-old woman doing that? It's like, wow, I want to meet her sometime. But it's an occupiable wall. But it's also making this reference to the Berlin panel, these ideal cities, which I'm not going to get into, but one of them was painted and it's actually kept in the museum in Palazzo Ducale in Urbino, one of the ideal city panels. But it's a grid. If we think of the notion of the coherence of the grid, a very modernist device, but DiCarlo embeds his grid in the earth. Okay, so this is not a grid which is set and floating above the earth. You think of perhaps Mies van der Rohe, but it's a grid which seems to have its origin in the earth. Why? Because it's a modular grid which comes out of a structural system, where the brick is in compression, the concrete with its steel is in tension, and this language, this very, very simple language, is a reference to the structural cells which made up of all the spontaneous architecture, certainly in Matera, but also in other hill towns in Italy, that you're limited by your structural unit, and that structural unit is surprisingly consistent place to place. And so we find an ending on the terrace where I watched the sunset and had a glass of wine and some local cheese. And by the way, the wine was from the vineyard that you saw as we approached, and it was not very good. Very important to know. So we have this Mannerist, heterogeneous space, which then is inextricable from this larger discourse that DiCarlo was having with Urbino and with the historic forms. And together, these different elements all fashion this multiple language that you don't even have to know. You don't have to understand it. to be able to learn something and to be able to hear something from it. Grazie mille. It's pretty good. 3:11. That gives us 1 minute for a question. I mean, this is a longer pursuit. This isn't just one weekend I spent in the house and happened to get excited by it. Okay, it's part of a larger discourse, certainly. It's hard to, Frank, you don't even have a question. This is serious.
You mentioned, I'll ask one. It's not really a question, observation. You mentioned Rossi.
Aldo Rossi.
So let's imagine this big bracket. It's called architecture. Inside that bracket is Aldo Rossi and the architect that you presented, Giancarlo.
Yeah,
We've added another one.
yeah.
How do you explain the range that we see as we study architecture? What would not be included?
Well, I think both of them bear the hallmark of that time period. Okay, and they both bear the hallmark of working as an editor at Casabella under the work of Rogers. I believe that we're looking at different ways to formulate a question. And I really believe that the result is not as important as if we go back and try in our minds to put together that question. And for Rossi, the answer, I love Aldo Rossi's work, but God forbid I have to spend even 24, 26 hours in it, right? Because his search and his question is sort of embedded in a critique of modernism. Carlo refrains from critique. You know, we could claim that he's critiquing modernism by taking the grid and sticking it in the ground, but he's not. Carlo is looking for a way to establish a civil society. So he's looking for places for social discourse. Rossi limits that to what he calls collective memory and urban artifacts, which somehow are part of the collective grasp of who they are, this identity of a place. But it stops right there. It doesn't meet the humanist approach or the neo-humanist approach that Carlo brings, where he's interested in literally, and this is a very difficult building to photograph, isn't it? I mean, there is no hole. It's like a medieval city. There's no hole there. Whereas for Rossi, it was only the hole. You know, if one of the spaces happened to be intriguing, well, that was good, but it was unintentional. You know, so we're asking a question from two very different vantage points. One which you know is searching for sort of an image which then can be read as a text, and the other who is interested in the building not being a text. In spite of my hermeneutical interest here, the building's not a text, Frank. It speaks this multiple language, and we have to listen to it if we want to understand it. They're difficult because they hated each other. Well, not literally. You know, Giancarlo's one of his closest friends during the war years, immediately afterwards, all the way through the end of the 60s, was none other than Italo Calvino. They used to spend time in Urbino, sitting there, drinking wine, probably smoking cigars, and talking about cities. And so Carlo writes a book which is almost a parallel book to Invisible Cities. You know, so they're having this conversation, and I think that conversation is what allows Carlo's work to mature and to change. And Rossi, I can't say he's interested in that conversation. There's your lamp. You can take that home. So, Okay, guys, I'm around for the rest of the semester. Don't be bashful. It'll take me a while to figure out your names, but I'll be delighted to talk with you about Carlo, Team 10, the architecture of crisis, which obviously we're in right now, and study abroad. Take care, guys. Thank you.